The strongest man in the room is not always the loudest. He is not always the biggest. He is not always the one with the most money, the most status, the most followers, the most to show for himself. Sometimes the strongest man in the room is the one you would never suspect, the one who is quiet, the one who does not need to be noticed, the one who moves through the world with a steadiness that does not come from what he has accumulated or what he has achieved, a steadiness that comes from somewhere deeper, from something that cannot be taken by circumstance or stripped away by failure or shaken by the opinions of other men. That man has a secret, and the secret is not a strategy. It is not a morning routine someone sold him. It is not a mindset he adopted from a book. The secret is older than any book written by any man. It is this: he kneels, not to other men, not to the world and its demands, not to money or comfort or fear or the shifting approval of people who do not know him. He kneels to one thing and one thing only. And because he kneels there, he does not have to kneel anywhere else. Because he bows in that one place, he stands fully upright in every other place. Because he is submitted to the highest authority that exists, no lesser authority can bend him. This is the paradox that the world does not understand, that the man on his knees before God is not a weak man. He is the freest man alive. The modern world has made a mistake about strength. It has confused independence with freedom. It has told men that the strongest version of themselves is the version that needs nothing and no one, that bows to nothing, that answers to no authority beyond himself. That is, in the fullest sense, self-made and self-sufficient and self-governed. And men have believed it, because it sounds like strength. It sounds like the kind of man worth being. But watch what happens to that man, the man who has decided he answers to nothing above himself. Watch where his strength actually comes from and what it is actually made of. He is strong when things are going his way. He is confident when the money is there, when the relationships are good, when his health is fine, when the world is cooperating. But remove one of those things. Remove the money, or the status, or the health, or the relationship, and watch what is left. Because a man whose strength is sourced in himself has no reserves beyond himself. When he runs out of himself, he runs out. And every man in some season of his life runs out of himself. Exhaustion comes, loss comes. The thing he built his identity on proves fragile. And in that moment, the man who thought he needed nothing discovers that he was more fragile than he knew. The man who kneels to God is different, not because he is immune to difficulty, not because his life is easier or his loss is less real, but because his source is not himself. When he runs out of himself, and he will, there is something beneath him that does not run out, a foundation that does not shift, a strength that is not dependent on his circumstances being favorable, or his feelings being cooperative, or his confidence being at its peak. He kneels because he knows he is not the source. And the man who knows he is not the source never acts as if he is responsible for holding everything together alone. That knowledge, that deep, settled, tested knowledge, is not weakness. It is the most sophisticated understanding of strength a man can arrive at. There is a word that the world has confused and cheapened and almost entirely emptied of its true meaning. The word is humility. The world thinks humility means smallness. It thinks humility means the man who steps back and apologizes for existing. The man who makes himself less so that others can feel more. The man who does not speak, does not lead, does not stand for anything, because standing for something might be perceived as arrogance. That is not humility. That is fear wearing humility's clothes. True humility is not self-diminishment. True humility is accurate self-knowledge. It is the man who knows exactly what he is, his strengths and his limits, his gifts and his gaps, what he is capable of and what is beyond him, and he is not threatened by that knowledge. He does not need to be more than he is. He does not need to perform or inflate or pretend. He is what he is, clearly and without apology, and he knows the difference between what belongs to him and what belongs to God. C.S. Lewis wrote it this way: humility is not thinking less of yourself. It is thinking of yourself less. The humble man is not a man who has a low opinion of his own abilities. He is a man who has stopped being preoccupied with himself altogether. And because he is not preoccupied with himself, he is free. Free to see the world clearly. Free to serve other people genuinely. Free to act without the constant distortion of ego asking, "How does this make me look? What does this say about me? What will people think?" The man who kneels before God has arrived at that place, not by being told to think less of himself, but by having encountered something so much larger than himself that his own preoccupations naturally became smaller. The man who has truly stood in the presence of God, in prayer, in Scripture, in the crushing moments of life where nothing but God was sufficient, that man comes away different. He comes away with a more accurate picture of the universe and his place in it. And that accuracy is not deflating, it is liberating. You are a man. That means the ego that insists on being its own God is your most dangerous opponent. Not the world, not your circumstances, not the people who have wronged you, the version of you that cannot bend, that cannot be corrected, that cannot receive from anything higher than itself. That man is not strong. That man is a man building on sand and calling it a fortress. I want to talk about prayer, because prayer is where the kneeling happens most literally. And prayer is the most misunderstood discipline in a man's life. Most men approach prayer the wrong way when they approach it at all. They treat it like a transaction. They come to God with a list of what they need, and they present the list, and they wait for delivery. And when delivery does not come on the schedule they expected, they conclude either that prayer does not work, or that God is not listening, or that they must not be doing it correctly. And gradually the practice fades, and gradually the connection fades with it. But prayer was never meant to be a transaction. Prayer is not primarily about getting things. Prayer is about contact. It is about the act of a man turning toward the source of his life and acknowledging the relationship that exists there. The relationship of creature to creator, of child to father, of servant to king. Not because God needs to be reminded of his authority, but because the man needs to be reminded of his position. Because the man who starts each day by kneeling, by acknowledging that the day he is about to enter is not his own creation, that the breath in his lungs is not his own doing, that the capacity he carries was given and not manufactured, that man enters the day with something different in him. He enters with perspective, with proportion, with the ability to hold the difficulties of the day without being crushed by them, because he has already stood in a place where all of it is seen from a height that reduces it to its proper size, Paul wrote from a prison cell, not a metaphorical prison. Stone walls, chains, the real thing. And from that cell he wrote, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving let your requests be made known to God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds." He is not writing a self-help formula. He is writing testimony. He is describing something he has actually experienced. A peace that arrived not because his circumstances improved, not because the problem was solved. A peace that arrived because he prayed, because he turned toward God and made contact. And something happened in that contact that his circumstances could not produce and could not take away. That is what prayer does for a man. Not always the answer he wanted, but always the thing beneath the answer, the presence, the peace, the reminder that he is held by something that does not lose its grip. A man who prays regularly is a man who has a daily practice of returning to his actual size. Not small, but accurate. And from that accuracy, he can live, he can lead, he can love the people around him from a place of overflow, rather than from the desperate, grasping place of a man who is trying to fill himself with what only God can give. Every man who has built something that lasted, every man whose name still carries weight centuries after his death, was a man who understood this. David, who the scripture calls a man after God's own heart, was not a man who had it all together. He was a man who failed dramatically. He sinned in ways that had consequences for the rest of his life. But what made him a man after God's own heart was not his perfection. It was his posture. He kept returning. He kept kneeling. He kept turning his face back toward God, even after the worst of himself had been fully on display. The Psalms are not the writings of a man who never struggled. They are the writings of a man who struggled constantly and kept bringing every struggle back to God. Abraham, called the father of faith, the man through whom every promise to every generation was channeled, he was called out of everything comfortable and familiar and told to go somewhere he could not see. He went. Not because he had certainty, not because the destination was clear or the path was mapped. He went because he trusted the one who was calling. And in that trust, in that act of following when he could not see, he became the man through whom nations would be blessed. Solomon, given more wisdom than any man before or after him, wrote this at the end of all his searching: "Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man." Not wisdom, not wealth, not achievement, not the accumulation of everything the world has to offer, which he had accumulated and which he declared meaningless in the end. Fear God. Know what you are in relation to what he is. Keep that orientation. That is the whole duty of man. You are a man. That means the most important thing you can get right is not your career, not your finances, not your reputation. It is your relationship with God. Get that right, and everything else has a foundation. Get that wrong, and everything else, however impressive it looks from the outside, is being built on a surface that will eventually give way. I want to talk about what it means that the man who kneels to God bows to no one else, because this is where the paradox becomes practical. This is where the theology becomes a way of walking in the world. When a man's identity is rooted in God, when he knows who he is because he knows whose he is, the world loses most of its leverage over him. And the world has enormous leverage over most men. It holds them with the threat of disapproval and the promise of status. It moves them with the fear of being left behind and the hunger for being respected. It controls them with trends and opinions and the constant shifting definition of what a successful man looks like. Most men spend enormous energy managing how the world sees them, performing the version of themselves that gets the most approval, suppressing the parts of themselves that might be criticized, building the image rather than the substance, and living in the quiet, exhausting anxiety of a man whose sense of self is permanently dependent on the verdict of other people. The man who kneels to God has been freed from most of that. Not all of it. He is still human. The pull of approval does not disappear entirely, but his core identity is no longer hostage to it. He knows his name was written before the world had an opinion about him. He knows his worth was established before he achieved anything. He knows the verdict that matters has already been spoken, and it was spoken in love, and it cannot be reversed by anything the world decides about him. So he can say the hard thing in the room without it destroying him. He can stand for what is true when the crowd is against it, because the crowd is not his judge. He can refuse what is offered when what is offered would compromise who he is, because what is offered does not define him. He can absorb criticism without collapsing, because his stability is not built on praise. That is freedom, real freedom, the kind that cannot be purchased or manufactured or arrived at by convincing yourself you do not care what people think. The kind that comes only from having something more solid than people's opinions to stand on. When you kneel to God, you stand up from that kneeling as a different man, a man who answers to a higher court, and because the higher court has already spoken in your favor, the lower courts lose their power to terrorize you. I want to talk about the man who does not kneel, the man who has decided, consciously or by default, that he answers to nothing above himself, that he is the highest authority in his own life. Watch what happens to him. Not immediately, not in the first year, when the self-confidence is exhilarating and the absence of accountability feels like freedom. Watch what happens over time. Without something above him, the man begins to orbit himself. All roads lead back to his own perspective, his own comfort, his own needs. He becomes the center of a universe that is very small, because it is only as large as he is, and the man who is the center of his own universe is almost without exception a difficult man to be around. He is difficult to love. He is difficult to follow. He is difficult to trust, because everything he does is filtered through the question, what does this do for me? Even when he is genuinely trying to be good, and something else happens. The man who answers to nothing above him ends up answering to everything below him. This is the irony of the life lived without God. The man who will not bow the knee to anything above him finds himself bowing constantly, desperately, to the things below him, to his cravings, to his fears, to what other people think, to money, to comfort, to lust, to the need for validation. He is not free. He is enslaved, and the chains are invisible because they are woven into his own desires. Every craving that goes ungoverned by a higher principle becomes a master. Every fear that has no faith above it becomes a tyrant. Every appetite that is not submitted to something larger than itself becomes a cage. The man on his knees before God is the only man who is genuinely free from all of that, because he has submitted his cravings to a principle higher than the cravings. He has submitted his fears to a faith larger than the fears. He has placed his appetites within a framework of meaning and purpose that tells him not just what he can do, but what he should do, and why it matters. That submission is not the loss of freedom. It is the only way to find it. There is something about the posture of kneeling that matters beyond what it means spiritually. The physical act of going to your knees is itself an act of discipline, of intention, of a man interrupting the momentum of his life to do something that does not feel productive, that the world will not reward him for, that produces no immediate visible result. And a man who can do that, who can slow himself down, who can be still, who can bow his head and be quiet in the presence of God for 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 30, that man is practicing something that overflows into every other area of his life. He is practicing the ability to be still. And the man who can be still is a man who does not react from his worst impulses, who does not speak before he has thought, who does not act from fear when fear is the loudest thing in the room, who can sit with uncertainty without immediately reaching for a distraction, who can hold a difficult emotion without letting it make his decisions for him. In a world of noise, the man who can be still is exceptional. In a world of reaction, the man who can pause is powerful. In a world that has forgotten how to be quiet, the man who kneels every day and spends time in silence with God has developed a capacity that most men simply do not have. The prayer mat, the bent knee, the bowed head, these are not signs of a man diminishing himself. These are the training ground of a man who is building the interior stillness that all real strength requires. You cannot lead from chaos. You cannot decide wisely from panic. You cannot love consistently from a place of self-absorption. The man who kneels is building the opposite of all of those things. He is building quiet and groundedness and the kind of presence that other people can feel when he walks into a room. I want to close with this image, a man on his knees, not because he has been defeated, not because the world has broken him, but because he has chosen to be there, freely, deliberately, in the full possession of his strength and his dignity, and he is on his knees before God. That is not the posture of a weak man. That is the posture of the strongest men who have ever lived, of soldiers who won great battles and came home and got on their knees to give thanks, of kings who ruled nations and knew that the throne was lent, not owned, of fathers who stood tall in the eyes of their children because they first stood small in the eyes of God. You are a man. That means the world will offer you 100 versions of strength that do not require you to bow to anything. It will tell you that the bowing is the weakness, and the not bowing is the power. It is wrong. It has always been wrong. The man who bows to nothing ends up controlled by everything. The man who kneels to God, only to God, freely, daily, in the quiet of his own room where no one is watching, that man stands up from his knees carrying something the world cannot give him and cannot take from him. He stands up with the knowledge that he is not alone, that the thing he is carrying is not only his to carry, that the life he is building has a partner who is infinitely more capable than he is, that his failures are not the final word, that his weaknesses are known and accounted for by the one who made him, that the person he is trying to become is not a project he has to complete by his own effort alone, but a work that God is doing in him, if he will let it be done. And with that knowledge, He goes into the world differently. He leads differently. He suffers differently. He succeeds differently. Everything is different, not because his circumstances changed, but because the man inside the circumstances changed. Because he found the one posture that makes a man genuinely tall. He kneels, and from his knees he rises. And the man who rises from his knees before God is the man who stands tallest in every room he walks into for the rest of his life. Go kneel. God bless you. Thank you so much for the support in the comments section. I read all the comments and it really inspires me to make this content more. Thank you so much. God bless us all.